Hello everyone, my name is Pixlriffs and welcome back to the Minecraft Survival Guide. I hope you're all having a good day. Today, we're going to take a look at a technical farm or two. We're going to start talking about farming pale hanging moss, since we have that as a relatively new addition to the game, and we're going to do that inside the interior of this freshly renovated factory, where you may remember us building the mud machine over here, well technically the clay machine as well, since the dripstone here serves to turn the mud into clay by drying it. This is the dripstone themed area, I guess. This is a regular dripstone farm and the lava farm that we've had for a little while, and I've been renovating the interiors of a couple of my old buildings that have lain untouched for a while on my Twitch live streams lately. We're probably going to design a beekeeper's cottage at some point. We might do that in a video instead of on stream, but we can always do interiors and stuff like that on streams. I'll go over a bit more of that later in the video for those of you who are interested, but for now, we're going to talk about farming pale hanging moss and how similar it is, but how subtly different it is from farming other types of hanging plants like weeping vines, which you'll find in the nether. So the first thing to note is that pale hanging moss is pretty easy to farm. You can place it underneath basically any solid block. I'm not certain if it will go underneath any transparent blocks, but it seems to actually, underneath this copper grate walkway that I put around the side of the room. And if you want more of it, you simply bone meal it. So we've got some bone blocks here. We'll just break those down into bone meal. It will grow one stage. You can bone meal any part of the plant in order to grow it one stage. You don't just have to bone meal the ends that still need to grow, but then of course it needs shears or perhaps a silk touch tool to acquire. Let's actually test that right now, because I haven't used a silk touch tool like a hoe, for example, to try and farm any pale moss. Let's see if we can get hold of it that way. We can. Okay, well that makes things a little bit easier in terms of durability. If you compare the durability of shears, which can only be made with iron, to a netherite hoe, for example, you can't see the durability on this one right now actually because it's completely mended, but netherite tools have 2031 durability, while shears only have 238, and since you can place unbreaking on both of these, they will last about 4 times as long when they have unbreaking 3. So shears can, in theory, shear close to 1,000 items before they have the potential to break, whereas a netherite hoe can shear up to 8,000. So in this case, I think it's safe to say that we can probably use a netherite hoe for this, but shears are an option for you if you want them. So the manual farming approach to this is pretty straightforward. We can even put bone meal in our offhand and the tool in our main hand, simply right click when we want to grow stuff and left click when we want to harvest stuff. The important thing here, though, is that when you break pale hanging moss, you do not get any of the lower blocks than what you've broken. So you basically want to break these one block at a time in order to get the most out of it. Weeping vines work slightly differently. Those are the red vines that you find dangling from crimson trees in the nether, and those have the potential, the chance, to drop some of the lower blocks if you break a higher block. But once again, that's still a random chance. That's not necessarily going to get you every single vine on the way up. In fact, it's almost certainly not going to. So if you want to harvest with the greatest efficiency, you still need to break these plants from the bottom up. And this is where the height of a room like this kind of comes into play, because if I position myself right here, I can bone meal a bunch of the hanging moss, then simply step back and use the silk touch hoe to destroy all of it at once. Or if I'm able to place the hanging moss on a block that's slightly outside of my reach, let's say I place a bone block like here, and we'll attach the hanging moss to the underside of that. I can jump, bone meal all of this, it goes all the way down to the ground, and then we end up destroying all but the top block here, allowing me to make sure that the seed plant, the plant that starts this chain of hanging moss that we've bone mealed here, remains up there near the ceiling in almost like a permanent farming spot, meaning that there's always going to be something here for us to bone meal even if we haven't brought any pale hanging moss with us. Since pale hanging moss doesn't drop on its own, however, we can't do anything like destroy this block in order to gather the hanging moss. It's simply going to break. So if we want to get hold of more of it, we can employ some automation in order to do that, and that's where the redstone box is going to come in handy. So we're going to set up our pale hanging moss farm up here on this catwalk. It doesn't need a great deal of space in order to set up, and we're going to set up some other farms for similar materials, maybe in some of these alcoves around the outside, where currently I have ladders. Maybe they could even go in the corners over here and over there. At the back of the factory here, we're going to pillar up a couple of blocks so that we can place an observer facing outwards, like so. Obviously got to place that so whether the observer is facing towards the area where we want it to detect stuff. If you placed it against the wall, it would be looking in towards the wall. We're going to add a solid block behind the observer so it'll conduct some redstone dust. We're going to place some temporary blocks above the observer like so, and we're going to have some dispensers attached to the front of those facing downwards. Behind here, we're going to run some redstone dust from the block behind the observer onto the observer and up over the top of these 5 dispensers. And along the front here, we're leaving a bit of room where if you wanted to, you could add a row of hoppers. These could feed bone meal directly in from whatever container you want to put here. In this case, I'm just going to put about half a stack of bone meal in each one of these for the sake of demonstration. Now, as soon as we place some pale moss in front of this observer, it's going to be bone mealed a couple of stages. And this is where the player can simply stand and look up through the pale hanging moss and cut down everything. And you'll notice that as you do so, it's just all going to regrow again. In fact, the best option I think here would be to stand on some sort of solid block either side and simply look directly through one line of the pale hanging moss, because as soon as this machine generates more, it's going to break it again. We are taking advantage here of the player's maximum reach, because the player can hit blocks up to 5 blocks away horizontally. So if I'm standing here on the edge of this note block, my maximum reach does extend to the piece of pale hanging moss on the far side of this. If I'm standing directly in the center here, I can simply remove every block of hanging moss along the way. And at this point, I think the system is actually out of bone meal, but we've managed to farm 2.5 stacks of pale hanging moss from this. So I'm going to fill these dispensers up, each with 9 stacks of bone meal. I can't imagine us needing more pale hanging moss than this in our lifespan of this world, so we'll probably be done for the foreseeable future at this point. But if you plan on using pale hanging moss with any regularity, it can be really nice to have a fast, efficient farm like this instead of having to set everything up and bone meal it manually. All we need to do to set off the farm is right-click that central plant with bone meal. The whole thing will grow once, and then we can simply look through this and harvest it at our leisure. Now, one other thing that I've just noticed, and it really bears repeating in the context of what we were discussing earlier, while we can use shears or a silk touch tool in order to farm this, the silk touch hoe has not taken any damage whatsoever when we've mined all of this pale hanging moss with it. And I've now gathered over 6 stacks of the stuff just using this hoe. No durability was taken off it whatsoever, and this plant does not produce XP, obviously, so that's not the hoe having mending or even unbreaking. That is simply the durability not being affected by mining this type of block, since it's a block that can be mined with the hands, I guess. But is the same true of shears, which will actually break this with exactly the same speed as an efficiency hoe, but as you can see, that's taken off nearly half the durability of this set of shears in order to do that, whereas using a silk touch hoe will do so in perpetuity. I think you might even be able to use a silk touch pickaxe for this, considering it breaks instantly. And once again, no durability was taken off my silk touch pickaxe by doing that, because once again, this is a block you can break with your hands. So we've now got about 10 stacks of pale hanging moss. I would say this machine is a success. We'll probably dress this up a little bit to make it fit better with the aesthetic that we've got for the factory, because right now it feels a little bit dangly on the back wall there. It feels kind of isolated and doesn't quite feel in keeping with its surroundings. And so you might be wondering, Pix, why are we harvesting all this pale hanging moss anyway? What's the secret? What do we not know about pale hanging moss? And the answer is, quite frankly, there isn't a whole lot you can do with it right now. It doesn't have any crafting recipes. You can't make mossy cobblestone with it because that's made with green moss. It doesn't even craft into regular pale moss blocks if you have a lot of pale hanging moss. Well, the reason for that is actually one to do with ambience, and it's not just physical, in-person, visual ambience, it's also sound ambience as well. Because with pale hanging moss and the pale garden biome in general, Minecraft has introduced a really interesting means of introducing ambient sound into the world, and that is through the combination of pale oak leaves and pale moss. It's a lot more noticeable when you place a lot of these blocks together, but you'll notice that the eerie noises are triggering in the subtitles every so often. I'll be quiet here after I've eaten this carrot, and we'll try and listen out for a couple of them. There we go, there's a couple of them there. It's very subtle, and it really doesn't happen too often, but with a large enough layer of these, in fact, it's actually happening more just when I'm talking to you, you'll find that a few eerie noises trigger every so often throughout the day. And control over sound ambience is something that the player has not really had a huge amount of lately, but the fact is we can take the ambience out of the Pale Garden and move it elsewhere in the world, which is more control over the soundscape than we've had for a while, unless you're meddling with data packs and using note blocks to trigger sounds that are in the game's sound library but aren't otherwise accessible to you in survival Minecraft. Incidentally, it doesn't just have to be pale oak leaves. I believe pale hanging moss will generate those ambient sounds when it's attached to pale oak logs as well, so you don't have to have the leaves absolutely everywhere, but in my case, I'm going to. I think this is a really interesting tool for us to use for the ambience of builds like this pirate ship that I built on the floating rock a while ago, and to tie in with what I said earlier about us touring some of the stuff that I've been doing on a live stream, I have finally done the back of this, and there was only some small section of it in this corner that was not done previously, but I finally came around and added a back wall to this area, a little waterfall coming off of here, and this moss ramp up finally has a platform at the end of it, along with incorporating some of the landscape here into an area that supports the ship above it. I have kept this cave underneath it though, and it's currently very heavily lit up because I didn't want mobs to spawn down here and potentially risk bits of the project being blown up, but down here I think is the ideal environment to double up on what we've learned about pale hanging moss and ambient sound. If we end up placing some pale oak leaves around here, we can maybe have them dangle from the ceiling a little bit. It creates this simultaneously rocky feeling along with the toughened stone that's in the walls, but also this organic feeling environment to it. Maybe even the particles that are drifting down, while they look like leaves, could also be little pieces of dust falling as the people on the surface kind of stomp around, or it could be particles of rocks falling from an unstable cave environment. Either way, if we place some pale hanging moss on the underside of some of this, it's going to beef up the foliage a little bit, it's going to make the foliage feel a little bit more bushy, but it's also going to provide subtle, eerie, ambient creaking sounds, which, if we're on the surface up here and walking around by the ship, those eerie creaking sounds, if we can hear them from far enough away, are going to contribute to the notion that this ship is moving and bending in the wind, and that the material of the ship is expanding and contracting with the heat of the sun or the cold of the air around it. If I want some control over which direction the sounds are coming from, we could even go inside and place some of them up in areas where there's a cavity in the ship's structure. If we wanted to have some below the decks here, we could place a bunch of the pale hanging moss attached to some leaves or some logs underneath here, and then just section off that part of the ship, close it off so that it's not a part the player can explore, and just leave these cells of ambient sound in there for us to have as natural ambience of the wood of the ship as we explore it. Not to mention we've also used a few hanging roots on the outside of the landscape here, so if we wanted to, really, we could put some pale oak leaves and hanging moss in plain sight here, add that to the foliage we have here on the outside, or artfully conceal it in little alcoves where you could just see the pale hanging moss hanging down and the leaves are concealed, and that could be a really great way of introducing these sounds to the area, as long as we can create areas where there are a lot of them, because a single leaf and a single moss block on its own is only going to make a couple of sounds maybe per in-game day, which is not enough really for what I want the ship to be capable of. But like I said, let's say we hop up here, we're going to place a bunch of the leaves in this space, and we're going to place a bunch of pale hanging moss below that. And then, it's not going to happen right now, but let's say we block off this section of the ship here so that it cannot be accessed from just walking around the inside of the cabin. Yes, with all of that up there, you get that occasional crunching, creaking wood noise, and it's triggering every so often. I think that's great. I think it's really nice to have those happen from time to time as we're exploring the deck of the ship here, and you probably want to go into your sound settings and turn up your ambient sounds as high as possible, assuming that these aren't block sounds anyway. Maybe we should test that. Maybe we should turn the block sounds all the way high up, and it's going to make my interactions with barrels and stuff a little bit louder for a second here. But if I'm standing on this side of the ship where we've placed some of those blocks almost directly underneath this walkway, there you go, you start to hear the ambient creaking, and I don't know for certain if that's gotten much louder, so I think that's probably still part of the ambient sound slider, but hey, good to know. You could go the whole hog here and leave a 2-block thick layer underneath the ship where all of the pale leaves and pale hanging moss can sit and provide this constant background noise of ambience. There we go. Gosh, the ambience is really kicking up a notch now. You could put those under the entire deck of the ship if you wanted to and have those sounds present everywhere you go, or you could concentrate them in specific areas for dramatic effect. Like if you're by the mast, you can imagine there being a little bit more creaking from the rigging and the sails and everything. So I think for the moment, with my block sounds turned back down a little bit, I'm going to drop off some of the pale hanging moss in here along with some leaves, and we'll add to the ambience of the ship as I continue to decorate it. I do want to come back and finish the sails and everything. Like, I want to get a little bit more done around here and probably decorate the interior of this as well. But you might be wondering, why am I going after this so much? Why am I producing this amount of pale hanging moss aside from just for a visual interest? Well, honestly, it's because of the ambient sound mechanic, and I want Mojang to do more stuff like this. So I think if we can all get behind this as a mechanic, if people really enjoy the fact that combinations of blocks can produce ambient sounds for your builds, then I think you can do a ton with that. And I'm hopeful that they'll give us the opportunity to move ambient sounds elsewhere. We already have ambient sounds coming from stuff like lava, we have sounds coming from things like campfires, and those are things that you can conceal in builds like this one, for example. This is the interior of the blacksmith that I did recently on stream. Got a bunch of shelves and storage containers and stuff for the blacksmith to store all of their tools and materials and that kind of thing. We got a smithing table in here so that we can do our smithing, a grindstone over there as well, and this forge, where somebody in chat suggested putting some of the resin clumps on here as embers leaping up from the fire so that we don't actually have to put real lava in here, because I don't have fire spread disabled in this world, so it could end up burning down some of the wooden components. But I think that looks really good as a little ambient effect. It's obviously static, so it's not like the embers are leaping and dying, but I do like the fact that resin clumps can provide that on the backdrop of the blackstone and basalt that we're using here in the forge. But without concealing a campfire or some lava somewhere in here, I would love to have the opportunity to make this sound like there is an ambient fire going and there is, you know, some measure of activity here in the forge. The only ambience we have in here right now is the parrots that you probably heard in the previous clips dangling up here from an anvil, and the parrot was just hanging around here at spawn. I think I brought it back from a jungle, so I liked the idea of dangling it from the anvil. That was another chat suggestion that I thought was a really, really good one. Got some cool banners up here as well whilst we're looking around, and I decided to put a little bit more color in here since it was mainly gray, brown, and a little bit of red for the walls. I put some flowers in pots here, including the torch flowers. Felt appropriate for the blacksmith to have this fiery looking flower in the forge somewhere. And we pushed an armor stand down into the space where an anvil would rest so that we have an anvil that's got some armor being worked on here, although the armor stand kind of pops out the sides of the anvil texture there, but I think it's kind of fun to have a diamond helmet here across the anvil being beaten into shape. But I think if Mojang gave us more opportunities to play around with movable ambience, even if it's just in subtle combinations of blocks like that, I think the results could be pretty spectacular for adding more immersive detail into our Minecraft worlds. So, last of all, let's get back to the factory to take a look at how we can apply the same techniques to other plants in a similar family. In particular, I want to talk about weeping vines and twisting vines, since you can get a bunch of these from the nether, and they're actually quite nice for decoration in certain environments. But getting hold of them is slightly different to what we can do here with the pale hanging moss, because, of course, weeping vines will occasionally, if there is a long trail of them, let's say we plant some here and have them trailing down to the floor, you can shear these individually to get every single block, or you can break it somewhere near the top, and occasionally you'll get more than one dropping from a bunch like this. But it is still most effective to shear them with actual shears, and in this case a silk touch hoe will still work in the same way that it does for pale hanging moss, so I think that's probably the best way to take advantage of this as well. We're going to build this farm here in the corner, taking note of the height at which we can no longer break a block attached to the topmost block over here. Like from the ground, I cannot reach this set of weeping vines, whereas I can hit this one, and that's kind of important because we want to make sure we don't break the one that is at the very top, being detected by an observer. An observer that's going to be facing downwards like this, so we do have to do a little bit of wrangling here, but that's fine. We can replace the roof blocks here for a second. We're going to run a couple of pieces of redstone dust across the top there so that it runs over onto a neighboring solid block. I'm going to remove these and replace the blocks of the roof that I just destroyed, which still conceals the farm from the outside. Of course, we're going to attach a dispenser underneath the block that has the redstone dust on it, and then we're going to attach a weeping vine to the underside of that. You'll hear the dispenser tick, and that means it will fire any time that the block in front of it changes. And the idea now is similar to the pale moss, but vertical, is that we can stand facing upwards and break every piece of weeping vine that generates which is going to be quite a lot, and you'll never break the top piece because it's simply too high up for us to reach. And immediately we have 2 stacks and change of weeping vines, which is about twice as much as we started off with. Now we can of course do the same thing with twisting vines, but in this case we need to invert the mechanism because twisting vines grow upwards from the floor instead of dangling down from the ceiling. That means we're going to arrange things here slightly differently. Our dispenser is going to be here. We're going to take out the copper grates for the floor here because the observer is going to be placed facing upwards into a block there. We'll have the observer output into a solid block with a note block directly next to it, and a second observer facing downwards into that note block so that every time the note block is activated, it transfers a redstone pulse to the dispenser. This means the farm's going to work ever so slightly slower, but we're also going to be using it from above instead of from below. So let me throw some bone meal in the dispenser right there. But we're going to climb some scaffolding, step to the edge of this block that is placed 5 blocks up, look down directly over the twisting vine, and break all of the blocks below us. In this case, it's actually important to make sure that we aren't crouching, since the player's reach increases by 1 block when you crouch, which means we could actually break the bottom twisting vine attached to the observer. But if you habitually crouch like me, you could always make sure that the block you're standing on is placed 1 block higher up. And I'll throw the copper grates of the platform back in there to make sure that no twisting vines end up falling through. So just like that, our factory is producing a few more materials. These aren't used for a bunch of crafting recipes, but they are really useful for getting around. For example, if I wanted to have a nice easy ladder that would be placeable on basically any solid block, I could start growing twisting vines, simply hold jump and shift and right click as I go, and I have basically a rope ladder that I can place more or less anywhere. It's also possible to use twisting vines to break your fall, which can lead to some really interesting clutch moves if you're into that. But for now, I'm just happy we have renewable ways of getting hold of these resources, and I'm really happy we've been working on some interiors around here. I think my next move is going to be to make a beekeeper's cottage that can hold both the honeycomb farm over here, which has been producing extra for quite a while, and the honey farm, which I'm pretty certain I need to go and restock the glass bottles in. But considering these can now have the crafter attached to auto-craft them into honey blocks, we might need to renovate this whole thing anyway. For now, though, that's where we're going to wrap up this episode of the Minecraft Survival Guide. Folks, I hope you've enjoyed this video. Hope you've enjoyed taking a look at some of the interiors we've been doing on streams, and stop by the streams if you can, because we're going to be making a little bit more off-camera progress there in stuff that doesn't make it into the videos. But thank you so much for watching. My name has been Pixlriffs. Don't forget to leave a like on this video if you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you want to see more, and I'll see you folks soon. Take care. Bye for now.